Hi, we're joined by the brilliant Gwen Stirling Wilkie today. Gwen is a first-class OD practitioner, and I came across her through our CIPD London OD Practitioners Network. And this is originally through a book that I had passed to me called From Physical Place to Virtual Space. And it was really at a time when we were just on the back of COVID and we really needed a sort of a pioneering book to kind of guide us through this difficult time as we switch to this new way of working. When we actually brought Gwen in, we had amazing feedback from all the participants. And what she was able to do was to combine the depth of thinking that goes into organization development, but to make it in a really consumable way so that when HR, when line managers, when organization leaders try to make that transition to the new way of working, they're able to do it successfully. And so she started to share with me that she's bringing out a new book. She was just starting to write it. She was busy researching it at the time. And I got her to promise to come back to me when she was ready to release the book. So I would have a chance to interview her. Also, I get to have a chance for a sneak preview of the book itself and the research findings that she's done. And she's back to join us today, actually. And she actually has the book. It's due out on October the 25th. And we'll add a link in the show notes to accompany this conversation as well. So for those of you that don't know you, Gwen, would you possibly just give us a quick introduction and what was your sort of journey into writing a book about the whole concept of omni-working?
Yeah, and what a fascinating journey it's been, actually. So I've been, I guess, an organization consultant, a team coach, a facilitator. I've been working in this space, both in organizations and with organizations for, I counted it up actually, and if I think of my time in organizations as a leader, it's over 30 years, which kind of makes me feel very old, but also very wise. That's the
Wise.
way I look at it. Lots of wisdom, lots of wisdom. And I love the work that I do. I love helping senior teams and individual leaders kind of look at things through fresh eyes. I love it, that moment when, the organizational wisdom, I believe that each organization has so much wisdom within it that is sometimes overlooked. And I think some of the answers to the challenges that organizations face can be found within that organizational wisdom. So I love kind of unlocking that and helping people see things differently. And I think that's probably behind the move that I made in terms of looking at what's happening with work post-pandemic. And it really started because I signed up for a professional doctorate at the beginning of this year. And I've been thinking the back end of last year and a lot of last year, people were asking me about, well, how do we do this hybrid thing? How do we facilitate or run a workshop or a meeting when we've got some people in the room and some people joining virtually? And then other people were saying, well, how do I do this hybrid thing as a leader? When my team aren't all in the office together anymore. And I realized that this phrase hybrid has got so many different interpretations and so many different meanings for people. And I kind of got a bit curious about it. And so as part of my doctoral inquiry, I wanted to talk to business leaders and organizational leaders to find out what had happened through that journey. What massive shifts did they have to make when we all went into lockdown and we were all working from home? And then what happened as things started to open up again? What choices had they made? What was working? What wasn't working? What were some of the things that they were still left with that they couldn't kind of quite find the answers for? And that's how it all started. And I spent probably about 4 months talking to this amazing group of leaders. And I tried to involve all different kinds of organizations, both in scale and size, in sector, in geographical location. So I talked to the chief HR officer of a big Japanese, multi international corporation. So I talked to him. I talked to somebody who runs a European kind of professional services organization, somebody from pharmaceuticals, somebody from a regional law firm, somebody from a membership, very specialist membership organization, but worked all over the world, somebody from a very high-tech industry in California. So a real mix, a real melting pot. And one of the things that came out in all of those conversations was, firstly, none of us have got this worked out. We're still experimenting. We're still trying to work things out. And secondly, coming together as a group of leaders to talk about it and to hear, some of the research that you've been doing is really helpful for us. We need to do more of this. And I thought, I think it's time to write another book. And that's where it came from.
Fantastic. And I guess what's really interesting about your research then is that all the different organizations that you've spoken to kind of position themselves differently. You've got professional services, which are sort of their model works in a certain way, their employees need to work in a certain way, sort of time is money. You're working with sort of multinational companies as well. What were some of the common threads that are coming out in the research that you're finding?
I think there were kind of two different perspectives, really. There were those organizations, and they were probably the bigger companies who were already used to working with teams from multiple countries, who had already started to make big strides even before the pandemic about distributed working, about working, how do we coordinate teams to come together when they're based in 6 or 7 different countries across the world. So for them, the transition into and out of wasn't as dramatic. And it was still problematical for them, but it wasn't as dramatic. Whereas some other companies who this really hadn't even been on their radar, it was a massive change, both going into the pandemic and coming out of the pandemic. But what was really interesting was the fact that this is still such an important topic. It's on the executive team meeting agenda every month. So, none of them said, we're really happy with what we've got it all sorted. Nobody is saying that at all.
Which is fascinating, isn't it? Because in organizations, we like certainty and we like things to be a certain way. And it's definitely echoed in our own sort of dealings with clients as well. They're still trying to find a way through. And there seems to be, again, whichever way you look at sort of the whole hybrid working piece, a tension between what the employees would like and what some leaders would potentially like as well. And I guess that creates difference. So you can
just to stop at that point, Garen, if I can just pick up on that, because I think in the book I actually draw a triangle, because I think what's missing from this is what is right for our customers and clients, because it isn't just about what us as an employer may want or what us as employees may want. There is a third voice in this equation, and that's the voice of the client and the customer. And what's really interesting was some of the professional services organizations were saying, it's actually a bit of a competitive advantage and a differentiator when we are saying to potential clients, we will come and work with you in person. We will come and meet with you in person. And one of the senior partners there was saying to me, clients are kind of like, oh, excellent. That would be really nice, because they're so used to people just going, well, let's just have a Teams meeting or let's just jump onto Zoom. That in-person thing is now something which is viewed as being an elevated differentiator.
And so for the purposes of definition, obviously you've come up with the concept of omni-working, which is a fascinating concept. For people watching this, what is your definition of omni-working?
So the word omni, the root word of it, is in all ways and in all places. So that's kind of where omni comes from. And so when I was starting to think about what's actually needed, it's about how do we help organizations and help people in organizations be able to work effectively, because that's what we want, but to be able to do that in all ways and from all places. And so that's how Omni-Working kind of came into life, really, because for me, it hits the important things. And so, you'll gather from this conversation that I'm not a huge advocate of everybody needs to come back in the office. And equally, I'm not a huge advocate to say, well, everybody needs to work remotely, because there isn't there isn't one answer. You know, there are many possible answers. And I think one of the challenges here for leaders in any organization is to go, what is the right blend for us? Because our operating context is different to other people's. We've got a unique set of circumstances. And so we need to create the right mix and the right blend that works for our organization in its context, in its operating environment. Hence the development of the Omni-Working framework, which for me is a way of guiding and supporting leaders to make sure they consider the whole ecosystem of the organization. It's a really systemic approach rather than just get hooked onto what I think is quite an unhelpful debate. That is what you see in the media about, you know, return to office versus working from home. And it's kind of quite polarized. And I really don't think that's helpful. And it's not looking broadly enough, because it's not about where people work. It's about how people work. If we want a true high performance organization, and if we're thinking of flexibility as being a competitive advantage for us.
Wonderful. Yeah, which opens up a whole new range of things, isn't it? Which is, again, obviously, with the mantras of organization development is, it depends.
Yes.
There is no one size fits all. Every context is wonderful. Every history is wonderful and unique to that particular organization. And I guess is it kind of sort of layering your own organization, then trying to sort of layer on top of it, you know, the research findings from other, and trying to find what is right for that particular organization at that particular time, is it?
Yes, yes. And staying kind of open enough. And you said at the beginning, you know, we all like things to be settled. We all like things to be predictable. So there's something happening in each one of us, you know, if we look through the lens of neuroscience, that makes us want to just give me stability, just lock it down into policy or procedure, and I've got something to follow. But it's just, the reality is that's not enough, you know, because that doesn't make the most of, you know, recruiting talent, you know, your talented people from anywhere. You know, nowadays you can recruit from anywhere in the world. But how do you help those individuals? How do you help everybody come together so they feel like they belong, they're able to contribute, bring the best of themselves, they're able to thrive, and they're able to create a high level of performance in a modern workplace? I think the definition of a modern workplace is being rewritten at the moment.
Right. Now, I've had a spoiler to some of the ideas in the book, and I'm dying to unpack them, and the particular big sort of ideas within the framework as well. You mentioned something there in terms of maybe the tools that we've used in the past to guide employee behavior and the way of working, like policy, isn't necessarily something that's going to get us through this particular time of work to help us get this new way of working.
Yeah, I think, and again, the organizations I've spoken to, a lot of them aren't making these things policy, because they're kind of going, you know, we need to just think about where they fit. We need to just continue to experiment, and we need to remain agile and flexible. And I think there's something here which for me is about, it's probably about a bit of a mindset, a bit of an organizational mindset. You know, are you viewing flexibility and distributed working? Are you viewing it as a benefit? Is it like an HR benefit and a perk for people? Or is it actually a really intrinsic part of your operational strategy? And I personally believe it should be part of your operational strategy, because it is, you know, it's a source of competitive advantage. Flexibility is a source of competitive advantage.
Yeah, and I think you get into the sort of the domain of words that get used a lot in organizations, but they don't necessarily get implemented in their true form. Like lots of organizations find out we need to be agile, we need to be flexible, we need to be systemic and all that. But when it actually really comes to it, it is almost like a paradigm shift in terms of how we work with the organization. I guess that kind of traditional 20th century model of management, which is to control and manage resource, in a way has to be sort of challenged a little bit, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I was reminded of a really great quote as I was pulling the book together. So I tried to kind of draw on quotes that you know, kind of reposition something in my mind. And there's one from Ken Robinson, who was an educationalist. Sadly, he's no longer with us. And he said, you know, we recruit adults and we treat them like children, because we want to control people. And it's kind of like, that's not how to bring out the best in people. Yet this situation, for some reason, excuse me, is triggering a lot for leaders and managers. And I think leaders and managers haven't quite worked out themselves yet, and haven't necessarily had enough developmental support to be able to say, I don't need to micromanage, because I'm getting the signals and the reassurance from the way I've set my team up, from the information they're given, from the agreements that we have about how we're working together, from a focus on delivering outcomes, that I get the signals that reassure me. So I don't need to kind of be micromanaging, because I can't physically see them sitting working. My question when people go, how do I know people are working at home? And I say, well, how do you know they're working just because they're in the office?
It's so true. So lots of triggered thoughts here. Yeah, but I really like it. So just the quote there, which I really like. So it's Ken Robinson, did you say?
Yes.
Great. I think that's a fantastic quote. But managers do get a hard time, don't they? They've got so much responsibility. They work in imperfect conditions. They've got targets on them. They're increasingly responsible for the well-being and mental health of their people and whatnot as well. So it is thinking about, how do we support them to this new way of working that's going to get the best out of them?
Yeah, I think the role of a manager and a kind of a leader in that sense of because we have different levels of leaders in the organization, and actually I think sometimes the roles are separated too much. But even if you are the chief exec, you still perform some management functions. There are still times when you are manager-like rather than leader-like. And so, we need to remember that within everybody, as soon as you have line management responsibility, you're always a mix of both. And you may spend a greater or lesser part of your day with that sort of mindset. But I think the expectations have changed hugely. And, again, in some of the research I was looking at as I pulled the book together, there was a little bit of developmental work done. And I'm not saying this is the same in all organizations, but generally speaking, there's been very little upskilling and supporting of leaders and managers into this new set of expectations that is being held of them in organizations. And I'm not surprised that they're struggling.
And that is the perfect jumping off point. I'm dying to get into the findings of your book here. So let's get super practical now.
Okay.
You've very kindly sort of put together like a framework in itself. Are you happy just to share that on the screen now?
Yeah, of course I can.
That's okay.
And I think if you look at these 7 areas and you sort of look at some of the titles of them, you probably go, well, they're quite familiar phrases. It's quite familiar language. So what's different? Why are these suddenly really important now? And I think it's the context. We know as context changes, so the nature of what we do and the nature of what we pay attention to needs to change. And when I spoke to the group of leaders I was working with, there were really key questions that they were holding and challenges they were actively trying to find solutions for that fitted into all of these spaces. And around the edge of it, which isn't shown on this image, is that sort of what I call a sense of belonging. So it's the culture that surrounds and sits all around these 7 elements of the framework.
Brilliant. And when I saw them all, my attention was drawn to all of them, but I was like, well, we haven't got time to talk about all of them today. But do you mind if we just, there's a few that sort of stood out for me, if we can just unpack a little bit, if that's okay?
Of course.
So one of the things, and pulling on what we were talking about earlier about the policy, and obviously an alternative to policy is principles to implement into an organization. And what you've sort of found and sort of mixture of your consulting work and your research is that creating guiding principles is a key part of this. Can you just sort of outline a little bit of that for everyone?
So I think for me, there's something about, if you're not going to do policy mandating, and just before I go into the guiding principles, I think for me, one of the big shifts that I'm encouraging through this book is to move beyond where. So don't get caught up in, does everybody come into the office 3 days a week? Do we have 5 days a week? How do we do that? I think we need to kind of elevate the conversation more strategically and think about how do we work? How are people enabled to do their best work? And when we think then, coming to the guiding principles, when we think about how do we help frame, so people still have choice and flexibility, I call it freedom in a framework. So how do we give the framework, which are the guiding principles? So that provides direction, it provides an element of consistency, it provides some inspiration. And guiding principles are generally these series of 4, maybe 5, sometimes 3, between 3 and 5 statements. And within those statements, that then sets the frame for every team, every department, every function to then have the freedom to work out how they're going to operate within those guiding principles. So one example that is being talked about a lot is the approach that Atlassian are taking. Now, Atlassian are an Australian-founded global collaboration software company. So if you're into platforms like Jira, and of course all of the other ones now have completely gone from my mind.
Was it Confluence, isn't it?
Confluence, and they've just bought Loom, who is like the video recording company. So they've just bought Loom, which I think is really, really interesting. But they very, very intentionally, right at the start of lockdown, so they're Australian based. Of course, Australia went into some really quite restrictive lockdown all the way through the pandemic. They're also very big in the US, and then they've got offices in different countries around the world. I think they're located in about 6 different countries around the world. They created right from the very beginning a very intentional distributed work strategy that they call Team Anywhere. And they view it as a giant social experiment. And I really love that sense of we're just trying to work out the best way. So we're being very, very experimental, and we're being very clear. And, we may change things, but for us, this is what we've decided. So they have very simple principles. So one is talent everywhere. So they want to be able to have access to recruit the best people globally. Work anywhere. How do you design a work life that works for you? And then reimagine teamwork. So how do they empower distributed teams? So those are their principles. Now, within those principles, each person can choose each day where they work from. So they have complete freedom to design work in the way that's right for them as an individual, that's right for the kind of work that they're doing. And then they also have this arrangement where up to 90 days a year, anybody can go and work in any global location where they have one of their offices. So there's like huge freedom, and that's about where you work. And then how you work, they default to asynchronous working. And I think we'll probably touch on synchronous and asynchronous. And I think that's one of the biggest shifts. If we're going to look at anything around optimizing working practices, the shift to more asynchronous working is a massive opportunity to unlock a different way of working. So they default to async all the time, which means people have got space for that deep work. That's really a really important element of the work that people are doing. We need time to do that deep thinking. And they also recognize that when they connect and how they connect, and they call it intentional togetherness, which I think is a wonderful phrase. And what that says is that they recognize there's massive benefits, and there are actually times in order to deliver particular business objectives that people need to physically come together. So they do a series of scheduled team gatherings. So they're planned so people know in advance when they're going to be, so you can schedule your work and life around them. But they are really important, like anchor points. And I think that's a really crucial piece of work for people when they're trying to get that balance between wanting to give people freedom to make choices about where am I going to work best to do my best work, but also that cohesiveness, that connection, that sense of bringing a sense of belonging together. And we know there's times when we need to physically come together, yes, to do certain work, but also to build relationships and to foster that sense of belonging. And so it's very, very intentional.
I really like what you're saying there, because I think sometimes a misunderstanding is when you sort of switch to working like this, it's not a free for all. It's not like
Yes.
people aren't making their own rules up. And I think I really like your phrase. I'm getting lots of good phrases in this, like freedom in a framework,
Yeah.
because those frameworks are quite strict, aren't they? If you go outside of them, then you've lost the trust of those around you as well. And I guess obviously with an organisation like Atalassian, then not all jobs are the same. They have different responsibilities. Some will have to be available to take a ticket to work on a software issue or a bug that comes up, and others might have more freedom to, spend their time how they wish. So each team has the freedom to develop its own working ways of working. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. And so what sits underneath the guiding principles then are at a very local level, and that might be a geographical team. So what does the operations in France look like? Or it might be a functional team or a project team. They then do a set of team agreements. And it's in the detail of that team agreements that arrangements are made around, okay, so we're trying to do as much of our work asynchronously as possible. But when are the times that we are going to make ourselves available for live collaboration, live in sync work? So it might be, every day between the hours of 10 and 12, that's when I'm available. If nobody wants me, I'll get on with other work, but I'm available for contact. I'm available for impromptu stuff. I'm available for, let's all just jump on, on whatever platform it might be to have a conversation about a particular thing we need to work through and a problem we need to solve. Let me get your input from 3 or 4 other people. But it's kind of time bound. And so people know where they are. We like freedom and we also like structure. It's really we're contradictory,
We are.
aren't we?
We are.
If
In
we
all our
have
messy
too
glory.
much structure and restriction, we don't like it. If we have too much freedom, we get a little bit disorientated. So it's that, how do we give people that sense of there is a boundary, and within that, you decide at a team level what works for you. So if you're saying every Wednesday, as a sales team, you're going to physically come into the office together, great. If you decide as an IT support team or of a finance function, it's going to be every 10 days or less or more. But that's decided at a team level. Meetings, communication formats, how we set up digital workspaces and digital workflows, all of our documentation, making it accessible so people can do their work, all happens at a team level.
Yeah, and I'm in. I guess the question that would naturally come to a lot of people's mind is, yeah, but what happens when people don't abide by the principles? Like, how do you know? How do you know, and how do you hold people accountable for that?
I think there's 2 ways. I think, firstly, it's part of the kind of unspoken expectation of mature adults kind of going, well, there's give and take here. Flexibility isn't all one way. And I need to accept that there's a sense of personal responsibility that we are signing up for, that we're contracting for. This, I think this is a changing nature of the psychological contract at work. It sort of sits into that sort of space. So there's a personal level of responsibility that says, with this freedom in a framework also comes an expectation and a responsibility that I expect from you. And I think then the other piece of that is down to how people are led and managed. I think performance issues are, in some respects, no different from performance issues pre-pandemic. You always have your people who are performing, and you have people who actually they're not delivering what you need them to deliver. But I think there's a change in focus around, just because somebody isn't coming into the office as often as you might want them to, or as often as you personally want them to, that doesn't mean they're not performing. And so that, for me, is the difference then when we focus on outcomes, not inputs. So if somebody is attending every meeting, if somebody is responding to emails really, really quickly, if somebody is coming into the office every day, that might indicate one way of somebody's engagement. But if they're not actually delivering what you need them to deliver, then how much are they performing? They're being present, but they're not necessarily delivering their objectives.
Yeah, it's more of a performance than performing, isn't it, really?
Yes.
The other one that of the many that grabbed my attention was, and you've sort of talked about it as a sort of an overarching principle too, is fostering a sense of belonging. Because again, it can be difficult to, when you are remote, to how do you get an organization's culture across to people? How does that feel different to working in any other organization? So what does fostering a sense of belonging mean for you in the book?
Yeah, I think there's two aspects of that. I think one of them is about belonging, you know, at a very it's a very human fundamental need, isn't it? You know, am I included? Am I accepted? Do I feel valued for the contributions that I make? You know, and so therefore, am I then feeling trusted and more open and more likely to collaborate and take initiative and all of those really, really good things around employee engagement and retention. And then the other side of that is, which I think is linked to belonging, is purpose. So how connected do I feel to my own sense of purpose in the world? And what connection do I have between that and the purpose of the organization that I'm choosing to work for? And we know for younger and you know, I can't remember the generations' names. There we go. Gen Z and Gen Y. So those kind of, I would say, the 35 age younger. Not that they're really strict classifications, but generally, younger people are more connected to a sense of purpose and are looking for organizations who meet a set of expectations around purpose and their sustainability and how they show up in the world as an organization, and their contribution to society and their contribution to more than just, you know, making money for shareholders. So that's important as well. So purpose is another important element of it. And I think the other thing about belonging, which is important here, is about, you know, having and adopting a flexible and distributed strategy, or omni-working as I call it, is, you know, about diversity and inclusion, about how working in a more flexible way gives opportunity to people who you may not be able to get their skills and experience and talent into the workforce for many, many reasons. You know, and we know we're starting to see areas where, you know, opportunities for women, people who are neurodiverse, people who have other caring responsibilities, which make it hard for them to be able to go into an office all day, every day. You know, we are able to gain the contributions and help them become part of a modern workplace, which is hugely important.
And gives you access to an amazing pool of talent as well, doesn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. Talent from anywhere. You know, if you set yourself up in the right way as an organization, you can bring in talent from all over the world.
There's one other one I wanted just to focus on, and before we go into like one of the last parts of your book, which I think people will find incredibly useful, is that how to actually create an omni-working strategy. But the other one that really sort of stood out, and you've sort of alluded to a bit, was optimizing working practices, because obviously that's something that you just do amazingly well, which is making things really practical for people to actually implement this in their organizations. What was it about that you defined?
I think for me, it's about, there are so many possibilities about how you create your working environment. I mean, if you just look at it as an individual, you know, some of the choices we make every day about how we organize ourselves, what are our preferences about, you know, online versus in person, what are our personal preferences around in sync versus async. So that's just as an individual. Then you multiply that as a team, and then you multiply that as an organization, you know. So the whole area of optimizing work is it's a whole area in its own right, and I'm not an expert in it. But when I started to look into it, there were a couple of things which really jumped out for me. One is this shift between in sync to async. So in sync when I'm working with people at the same time, whether that's in person or whether that's like we are now over Zoom. Then the async of I'm choosing when I do work, and we're not necessarily working on everything at the same time, but we're still collaborating. We can still collaborate on stuff. I can still put up, it might be a mural or a Miro or another digital collaboration tool, and we can continue to work on that together. We have shared documents. We might continue to develop a proposal for a client, through Google Workspace. There's all different kinds of ways that we're already using it. But I think for me, the big thing that I've focused on in this chapter particularly is about meetings and communication. Because everybody I talk to kind of goes, oh my God, if I need to jump on another back-to-back, Teams call, my diary is just full of Teams calls, Zoom meetings. And how do I have enough time to actually do the work I meant to do, rather than going to a meeting about the work that I meant to do, because I don't have time to do the work I meant to do because I'm in so many meetings talking about the work I meant to do. And so in the book, I take a really deep dive to go, okay, let's revolutionize meetings. And there's lots and lots of research out there about how unproductive meetings are, how much time we take and waste. Some organizations are going, well, let me put together a meeting cost analysis. How much is it costing us as an organization, just in people's salaries?
Oh, it's a scary calculation.
I mean, they're quite frightening when you start looking at those calculations. But really just thinking about, does everything need to be an hour's meeting? I think our online calendars encourage us to book slots for half an hour or for an hour, but you can go in and adjust it. Why do we need to book something for half an hour when actually all we need is 10 minutes? And how much can we actually do async before we get to the meeting? And this is one of the things I talked about in my first book, which you very kindly introduced at the beginning of our conversation. Thank you. Before we get to coming together either in person or coming together online, what can we do preparation beforehand? What short video can I send out? What to share data or information that I might have done as an in-person presentation? What collaborative platforms can we use to keep people up to date with what is happening around a particular project? And there's loads of software out there now to help us do that. So we're reducing the updating time that meetings are about. And in fact, what pre-thinking do I need my team to do before they come to a meeting? So when we're together, the work we are doing is the really added value work, where we are developing solutions, where we are solving problems, where we are doing things that we can only do when we come together. We're not doing updates because I can find out that information in a different way. So, so really taking a look at how much time is being spent in meetings, because I think there's a lot of available time there to do the really focused, deep work that we want to be able to find time to do.
Oh gosh, I'm hurting my head. I'm nodding so much. Yeah, because obviously, as someone who observes lots of meetings and things back, one of the reasons why meetings do fail is because people haven't done the pre-work. New ideas that are potentially controversial or proposals have been fed in. People haven't done the preparation. They're not thinking through the implications. It leads to poor decisions. It leads to people not being prepared or surprised, or group dynamics then comes into play. All sorts of things as well. So that there's a really compelling case. So that I imagine an organization that does all these things, so does the collaboration advance, does videos, takes away the whole need for updates, which is that cyclical thing that just kills energy in a meeting, doesn't it? Would actually, really improve productivity across the board.
And I think, I think the other thing is recognizing that it doesn't all happen immediately. One of the little vignettes and stories that I share in the book is about somebody who started to introduce different ways of running his team meetings. And it took a while. So the first time, I think he only had, out of his team, he only had a couple of people who'd done any preparation work, but he didn't give up. He kind of like went, okay, well, actually, this is really important, because people go, I'm too busy to prepare. And it becomes that vicious circle, and then gradually over a period of time, because he was setting and holding that expectation. And he was clear about, by working in this way, it means you're going to have more time to do the things you want to do, because you're saying you don't have time to spend one-to-ones with your team to help them develop and grow and solve their problems. So it takes time. It's not going to happen overnight. And it might take 6 months before everybody gets it.
Yes.
So it's just understanding that it will take a little bit of time, and you need to just be consistent, and you need to just keep, reminding people why we're trying to do this, why we're trying to shift something.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think that's probably one of the things. We live in an action bias world, don't we? And things such as like culture change or developing new ways of working, we're conditioned one way. That each person's career, 5, 10, 15, 20 years, how long they've been doing it, and all of a sudden we introduce a new way of working, and everyone has to get it in the first meeting or second meeting. But I think sometimes it is just having that patience, but that takes, again, courage from the leader to keep working at it and understanding that as long as we've got the trajectories in the right direction, that's okay.
Yeah, because we're changing habits, we're changing our own personal habits. We're asking other people to change their personal habits. And, we've built up some really good habits, and we've also built up some really less helpful bad habits. And I think we built up a lot of bad habits during our time where we were all working remotely during the pandemic. And we've kind of taken those back into, where we are now in terms of reimagining work and creating, a modern workplace. And so we need to unpick some of our behaviors. I've had to change some of the ways that I behave. Do you know, one of the things, I'm just going to tell you a little funny story. One of the things that really struck me, and I do it all the time, and I write about it in the book, about that, have you got a minute interruption? And I do it to my husband all the time. And I say to him, oh, have you just got a minute? Because he works in the office through the wall behind me. And of course, when you start to break it down, for me, it's great, because I get my answer and then I come back and I carry on. I'm staying in my flow of work. The impact it's having on him is that he has to break his train of thought. He then has to think about, what is it I'm asking him, or what do I want his input on? He then gives it. And then he has to then refocus himself to get back into the train of flow that I interrupted him for. And the research says it takes 23, 25 minutes to refocus ourselves, providing we then don't get distracted by something else in that refocusing process. And if that's constantly happening, it's no wonder we kind of like go, I can't get any work done. And if you combine that with, I'm now in a physical office with a lot of other people who want to just talk to me all the time, then that's not the place for me to get my deep work done.
Absolutely. But if you're practicing intentional togetherness, where everyone goes in the office to do that thing, where they build the sort of social bonds and strong ties and weak ties, that's the time to do it, isn't it?
That's the time to do it. And Annie Dean from Atlassian, who heads up Team Anywhere, she has I love this quote from her. She says, great work can be done anywhere. Teams should meet to meet, not to work. So for her, that intentional togetherness is about creating relationships. It's about bonding. It's about, building those really strong bonding connections, which mean you can then do your collaborative work better because you've got the relationship when you're not together.
Brilliant. And there's so much more in the book. We've only literally just scratched three things there. So there'll be loads of ideas in the book to sort of delve into as well. And sort of the final thing I wanted to focus on is that final sort of part of the book, which is bringing it all to life.
Yeah.
And, how do you take it from concept through to reality and start to really operationalize Omni-Working into the organization? How is that sort of, what is it you talk about in that chapter, and what tips do you have people that are building that strategy in their organization?
I think for me, I've taken two approaches in that final chapter. I think I've taken one which is hugely pragmatic, that says, there's loads going on for people. So let's just at a very, very simple level, what's one thing you can do as an individual? What's one thing you can do as a team? And then what's one thing you can do as an organization? And that's just a something to get started. So an individual level, I've said, just revolutionize your meetings, look at your meetings, look at your meeting calendar, and there's an exercise that, that is there for people to be able to do. And you don't, you can just get on with it. And then at a team level, well, actually, let's perhaps talk about a team agreement, which talks about and looks at how we work. And I've created like an Omni-Working profile, so people can go online and they can kind of input with each of these 7 and the sense of belonging, the 8th element, to say, where do I think we are now? So you get this sort of like starburst diagram, which will identify and help you work out, this is where we need to pay attention. So do that as a team, and then go, okay, well, what does it mean for how we work together? And there'll be ideas that immediately come up. And then if you've kind of got a bit of a bigger remit or a bit of better sense of appetite, and you're really wanting to think about how can we reimagine our organization, then there's a section there, that says, okay, let's just step back and really think about, what are the things organizationally that if we're wanting to shift flexible and distributed working into an operational strategy, what is the stuff that we need to do? And I talk about 4 things. I talk about what I call which is probably a strange phrase in this world, a quantum mindset. So I never imagined bringing in quantum thinking into my work, but when I did, I was triggered by this amazing guy who I'm connected with now on LinkedIn. And he said, in quantum thinking, we need to hold multiple opposing thoughts simultaneously. And then we need to be able to select the appropriate one to use at the appropriate time. And I think for me, I was like, yeah, actually, there's something in that about there are many, many possible options. There's no single right answer for everybody. But as a leader, I may be able to, I can identify what's the right answer for my context, as we were talking about earlier on. And I also need to hold myself open to the possibility that there are multiple approaches that will need to come into play at the same time in my organization. So that real kind of freeing up and recognizing how we might be steered by some of our own biases, because we all have those. The second area I talk about is what I call generative co-creation, which really sits at the heart of my organization development work that I do, about the principles of co-creation, about the principles of participation, and about how people are more willing to change their behavior when they have been involved in creating the change that they're going to have to bring to life. And I talk about shifting things from, I guess, a problem statement into more of a generative statement. So one of the questions that a lot of the leaders were holding was, how do we get people to come into the office more? Well, actually, I think, why don't we just shift that and reposition that into a generative statement that says, how could we create compelling places where people want to come together to connect and collaborate? Because if we spend our time and energy focusing on possibilities and ideas and experiments and things to test out, for that question, we're going to open up an awful lot more around, how do we get high performance flexibility and how do we create a modern workplace? So there's a section in there on generative co-creation. And I use this kind of phrase about slushy, about be more slushy in your approach. And if you think about those slush puppy drinks, they're kind of somewhere between frozen ice and water. And so for me, I use this as a metaphor about we need to have enough stability in the organization so we can test things out. So we're not in complete chaos, so we've got enough stability to test things out, yet we are still flexible and responsive enough to be able to make adjustments. So we're not rushing to tie everything down into policy and procedure, because we're still in this experimental zone. So stay slushy is probably a bit of a catchphrase. I also talk about neuroscience and all of the things that we've actually mentioned and touched on, a lot of neuroscience-based stuff about our desire for predictability, about how we want to be involved, how we want connection. And so building in intentional neuro-friendly approaches into creating an omni-working strategy. And then the final one is about how you mobilize change within the organization, and that ties into social capital, which we've not talked about yet at all, but it's under that cultivate connections part of the framework. And social capital, we've all got these really high influencers and these people who are very well networked in organizations, and so they are the people to involve in your generative co-creation, because they'll help mobilize and engage and spread the work that you're wanting to do in terms of creating your omni-working strategy. So the creation of the strategy and the mobilization of the strategy almost kind of happens simultaneously. And there's some really interesting research again out, which is included in this chapter, about the power of the 3%. So you only need to engage 3% of your workforce, providing they're the right 3%, the influencers in your social capital networks. Then they will then mobilize the rest of the organization in terms of the changes that will need to happen to create an omni-working strategy and bring that strategy to life and operationalize it for you. So you only need to work with 3%, but they need to be the right 3%.
Wow, that is a very comprehensive approach. There's quite a few things that stood out for me when you were sharing that. It's quite liberating in a way, because often we feel that switching to new working practices, like moving to hybrid and stuff, is beyond my pay grade on that. But I guess what you're proposing there is by saying even simple things like doing team agreements, then you can make local changes, can't you? There's a lot more in a team's gift than maybe they think there is.
Yes, absolutely. And I think people are often kind of, there's nothing I can do. But actually there is. We've always got some freedom to act. That's another phrase I use a lot. And we've always got some freedom to act. And, you know, you don't need anybody's permission to work on building better relationships with your colleagues. You don't need permission to be able to kind of go, oh, actually, I don't collaborate very much with that person over there in that team and that function, but they might be able to help me do my job better. If I don't know them directly, who do I know who does know them? You know, you don't need permission to do that. There's a lot that people can do at different levels, individually, as a team, and as a whole organization system. And I'm hoping, my intent is to make it practical, so whoever reads the book can go, do you know, there's some things here that I can do. And if my role requires of me to take a more strategic perspective and to really reimagine how work happens in our organization, I've got a guide here, I've got some things that I need to think about, which is in the Omni-Working framework, and I've got some things to get me going. That's my intent.
And it's a shift away from sort of senior management, consult and decide, is generative co-creation, which again, so much research supports this. It's such a really simple, elegant concept that you're coming up with there, isn't it? Which is, you know, just inviting people in and they feel great sense of ownership in terms of, you know, rather than being done to, they've got a stake in this actually working, haven't they?
Yes, but it requires some changes, because, you know, we know that there are some constructs of organizations which want and have historically been very command and control. A few people in senior roles will make decisions that impact everybody. And that's still a valid approach to organizational change. I'm not saying that should never happen. But what I'm encouraging leaders to do is go, do you know, there are other ways. And they may require, well, they will also require you to kind of take a step back You're still involved. You still will make some ultimate decisions. You set your framework. We're back to freedom within a framework again. You set your framework about where people have the space to decide. And it might be within your guiding principles, or it might be a different framework that you agree. And then you're there as a sponsor, you're there as an enabler, you're there maybe to have the final decision, you know. I'm going to share the story of an organisation who I think are really being very courageous and very experimental. And they're a construction company, and they're based in the UK. And a construction company isn't necessarily the first organisation to think of who wanted to take an approach about flexible working. But they had some real feedback from their employee engagement survey that said there was a real disparity between what was happening in the office for office staff and what was happening on construction sites. And they chose to do something about it, rather than going, well, you're a construction site and you can't do anything about it. They wanted to really create a very inclusive organisation, and it was a very key intent behind it. And so what they've done is they've chosen 2 construction sites of different kinds, different scale, and they're embarking on some pilot schemes. And the way that they've done it is they have supported the site manager and his team to have some conversations to say, where are our opportunities for flexibility? And, you know, this process has taken a while to prepare and set people up for success, because the organizational norms have been about the most senior people, the executive team, make decisions that people follow. And so there's been, not only within the construction site team, but also within the senior management team, have had to start to think about doing things differently. And so there's learning in there for everybody. And they're just at the stage now, so they've done some development work with the site managers and the supervisors to say, you know, here are some of the skills we need to develop. Here are some toolkits in terms of helping guide you around making this shift. And here's a way of working. And they are now in the middle of some trials on 2 different construction sites to see what happens. But their intent is to roll that out within all of their construction sites, and then potentially within other parts of their group of businesses. So they have machinery hire and other construction related businesses as part of the group of businesses. But I think they're being wonderfully courageous, because they're going, flexibility isn't just about location, it's also about scheduling. And research shows that schedule flexibility is actually more important for people than location flexibility.
It's fascinating. And I think if anyone's watching this and they're thinking, maybe not in my organization, if you can do something on a construction site, which is, you know, safety conscious, it's got a particular set way of working that's been the same way for generations, if they're able to introduce sort of flexibility and adaptability, then it really opens the floodgates for many other sectors as well, doesn't it?
It does. And I think that's what's so exciting about this, you know, this kind of area of work at the moment is, you know, I think there's huge opportunities, and with the right mindset, the right sense of, you know, well, let's see what we can do. Let's involve the people. I'll come right back to what I said at the beginning of our conversation about there is so much organizational wisdom that we don't tap into that can just make such a shift for us. And I think, you know, what they're doing is an absolute example of that. It's an operational strategy to be flexible, not a perk or a benefit.
Well, we were supposed to speak for half an hour. We've spoken for an
I
hour.
such a long time.
Not at all. I think it's just been just a sort of a testimony to how, what an engaging area that you're going into, a new way of looking at it, and just a really exciting time to be doing it as well. It's not a complete field, and it needs pioneering authors like you to put a sort of a stake in the ground and say, look, this is where we are, this is what we can do, and then it allows others to build on the shoulders of this book as well. So there's a lot of things that have stood out for me in this conversation as well, and I've just been making notes as we go along. I like the quote, which is that we recruit adults, but we treat them as children. I liked your idea of, or loved your idea of freedom in a framework, the idea of social experiments, and intentional togetherness. Your concept of generative co-creation rather than the antidote to mandate and inform, the fact that you can reframe the questions. Often organizations are asking the wrong question when they're trying to come up with a solution for this as well. And the whole idea of being more slushy, that kind of interstate between water and ice, like how do we do it? But it still has a form as well. And even with mobilizing it, like you don't have to get everyone on board. It's a movement as much as anything. And so how do you identify those 3% through your social capital, through your social networks that will do it? And actually the formulation of the idea and the plan itself is the beginning of the work already. It's not do that, then start to roll out the plan as well. So I always judge these, like who I like to have on them by what I learn. I've taken so much away from it. So Gwen, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for being really generous as well. And thank us for allowing us to get a sneak peek at your book. If somebody wants to buy a book, how do they get hold of it? Whereabouts is it available?
Will be available on Amazon, that good old book purchasing website, along with many other things. So it'll be available on Amazon, Omni-Working, and it's Omni-Working. Working effectively in all ways from all places. And then there is a website, omni-working.com, and LinkedIn. Either there's an Omni-Working page on LinkedIn, and then there's my own page on LinkedIn as well.
Brilliant. And if anyone has any questions, are they welcome just to contact you as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Get in touch, connect with me on LinkedIn, and or send me an email, gwen@omni-working.com, and I'd love to hear. I really want to. The final chapter in my book is really a request for people to let me know what you're trying, what you've tried, what's working, because I see this. I loved your phrase about it's a kind of a movement. I see this as something that is the beginning of something. Things will continue to change. There is no one single right answer. I'm learning every day. And I want people to tell me what they're learning, because, this work will continue to grow and change and adapt and morph as we all learn what a truly modern workplace is going to look like for us.
This book will have a second edition, won't it?
I
Brilliant. And if anybody wants to get hold of your original book, From Physical Place to Virtual Space, is this still available as well, is it?
It is, yeah, still available. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Gwen. Best of luck with the book and all the promotion that goes with it as well. Thanks for taking the time to see us. And really appreciate it. And hopefully, can you come again when you have your next book out as well, please?
I'd be happy to come again.
Thank you.